My name is Peter Berkowitz from the Director General for Regional and Urban Policy of the European Commission, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to this second lecture in our series of academic lectures which we have organized together with the European Regional Science Association. The title of today's lecture is EU Cohesion Policy and Europe's Shifting Economic Landscape. The lecture will be followed by a response from our discussant and by questions from the audience. We're happy here today to have two very distinguished academics who I am sure are well known to most of you. Our main speaker today is Phil McCann. Phil is a professor at the University of Groningen, where he holds the chair of economic geography. His research interests include regional and urban economics and policy, innovation, entrepreneurship, and industrial location. He's written extensively on these topics, but of course you know him as well as special advisor, firstly to Commissioner Hahn and now to Commissioner Kretsu. And he has also worked with us and other international organizations on many projects, including the Cohesion Report. Our discussant today is Gunther Maier. Gunther is professor at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, where he is head of the Research Institute for Spatial and Real Estate Economics. His main fields of research include regional economics, urban development, real estate markets, and spatial aspects of innovation. And he has written extensively on these subjects for books and academic papers. Another important thing is that Professor Maier is the chair of the organizing committee of the next URSA annual congress, which will take place in Vienna in August 2016. We have in the room, and I'm delighted to see so many of you today, representatives of the Council, the European Parliament, the Committee of Regions, colleagues from the representations, and of course from DG Regio. I see as well that we have a number of stakeholders and other Commission DGs. I hope we will have an interesting discussion today and that there will be many questions at the end. Now, I'd just like to give the floor to Professor Isabelle Thomas from the University Catholique de Louvain, who is representing URSA at this event. Thank you.
Yes, well, my name is Isabelle Thomas. I'm a professor at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Louvain-la-Neuve, and I'm conducting my research in CORE, which is the Center of Operation Research and Econometrics, which gathers economists, econometricians, operation researchers, and geographers. And as you guess, I'm the geographer, and I'm fascinated by spatial issues, especially at the border of several disciplines, somewhere at the limits of theory and application. I've no official role in the ERSA office, but I feel very close to it, especially as CORE hosts ERSA. And this is why I've accepted to be here today. I've been asked to welcome you in the name of the president, who couldn't make it today. So it's a pleasure to welcome two very active and well-known members of the ERSA, Philip and Gunther, one for speaking, the other one for discussing. And also a special thank to all of you for being here, for listening and enriching the debate about challenging questions. It's also the opportunity to thank the Commission for this nice opportunity. I wish you a very interesting afternoon, and I really think that it is very important for ERSA member to collaborate with the Commission and for the Commission to collaborate with scientists. I think it is a win-win situation to which I'm particularly interested because I've worked 5 years out of the university, out of the academic world. I think these decisions should always rely on robust scientific results, and scientists should be more concerned and aware that their research topic should be useful for decision makers. I think that nowadays it's not enough the case. So today it gives you the occasion of bridging this gap, of raising challenging topics for a more coordinated future. Thank you very much for being here, and I wish you a good afternoon.
Now, before giving the floor to the speakers, I'd just like to say a few little housekeeping things. We will have the lecture. I think Phil will speak for 45 minutes, and then Gunther will respond, and we'll have the opportunity for questions. As you have seen, the lecture is being filmed. So can I ask you to keep your mobile phones on silent mode and to keep the questions for the end, after the response of the discussant. Thank you very much. Phil, I think I can pass over to you, and I look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter and colleagues here. I'm very grateful to have been invited to give this talk, and I look forward to conversation with you all, and also with Gunther Maier, who I've known for many years. We have a lot of common interests in our work. So. In this talk today, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to cover a lot of materials. I'll go quite quickly through PowerPoints, but they're basically visual. They're diagrammatic. A lot of them are pictures, and that's intentional. It's not meant to be a technical talk. It's meant to be something that gives you a kind of an idea of where things are going in a quick snapshot view. And I'm going to try and do it by looking at the performance and the behavior of cities and regions in the European Union, both prior to the crisis, so really the decade before the financial crisis, and then what's happened since. And then the final part, I'm going to focus particularly on the question of demographic change, which I think is extremely important, very, very significant, but not really dealt with to a great deal in the arena of regional and urban issues, not nearly to the extent it should be. Before I go on, just a general point. The kind of background to this work, I have to acknowledge Lewis Dijkstra over here from the analytical team here, and Enrique Garcilaso from OECD. 2/3, 3/4 of this presentation also involves joint work that we've been conducting for quite a few years now. And the work is published. There's work coming out in academic journals, and I'm always happy to share this, to pass this on. These arguments today are not representative of the views of the European Commission, or the OECD, or DG Regio. They're my understanding, working with academic colleagues and researchers from different countries. And it's also based on insights from work that I'm doing with many, many other people in other arenas, also from different countries. The background to this, which I think is very important here, is people who work in the policy arena at whatever level, at Central European level, European institutions, at local or regional levels, at consortia, in the public sector, the private sector, the civil society sector. You know, people who are in that arena, my goodness, are busy enough. And therefore what tends to happen is a lot of the academic debates tend to pass many of us by, because we don't have time to read them, to reflect on them. We have no idea often where to search for them, because they're often in relatively obscure arenas which are familiar to academics but not to anybody else. And that's a big problem. At the same time, in the academic world, academics themselves are busy enough doing what they're doing, and are often largely, or at times completely, unaware of the policy agendas. Very little awareness of actually how particular policies work, how the policies are constructed, what the legal basis of these issues are, the kind of conflicting and compromise positions that often policy have to take. That's a natural order of policy making. These are complicated issues, and many academics, again, are unable or unwilling to take the time to actually start thinking about these things in the way that policy actors have to think about these things. So there's these kind of parallel arenas which often operate with very little, few limited linkages between them. So that's why these kind of talks are very important. What I will do quite shamelessly is I will highlight my own book. It's coming out in paperback, so that reduces the price significantly in a couple of weeks. This is about the whole reform of the cohesion policies in the last 5, 6, 7 years. But it's based on more than 20 and 30 years of analysis. This explains for academics what's going on in the policy arena, what the policy-related arguments, institutional issues, the political economy, logistics. These are critical. At the same time, for people in the policy arena, it sets out and spells out what the intellectual and the academic debates are, not just within Brussels, but how they're related to discussions in the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF, and much further afield, across the whole academic networks globally. What's going on here is, in some sense, specific to Europe, and in other senses, completely generic to what's going on in many other parts of the world. So this book is written explicitly for those two communities. And in the same way, what I'm going to talk about today builds on everything which is in this book. It has about 65, 70 pages alone of references, plus hundreds and hundreds of footnotes. The idea is to help people also to search. So every statement made in this book you can find out by Googling the websites, particularly the Commission websites, to find out the original documents. This is very, very important. These arguments are based on evidence, but most of us don't know where to look. It's very, very important to have a discussion which is based on solid foundation. So it is important for me to communicate this because it provides the backdrop to what I'm going to talk about now. And the way I'm going to do this is going to be split into 8 parts. And I'll skip through them fairly quickly. The main thing is to pull out the main themes. That's what I want you to think about. The first thing is talk a little bit about the cohesion policy reforms, just a quick thumbnail sketch that most of you, of course, are very familiar with. And then we'll look at the European situation pre the crisis, pre-2008. Because to understand what's happened post-crisis in Europe, you have to understand where things were at pre-crisis. Many of the insights that we see today actually had foundations and seeds which were already there. Just the majority of people were not aware of them or didn't notice them. It's also a data issue. It takes a while for data to be developed. And so there's always a time lag in how we look at these things. In some sense, we're looking backwards, always. But then what I'm going to try and do is look at where we are today and then think about a forward-looking perspective. And in here I'm going to focus on one major theme, which is demographics. And the idea is to at least to give us a kind of a roadmap. I'm trying to communicate to you a roadmap of where I think certain priorities we have to think about long term. Okay, here we go. So, of course, the cohesion policy reforms from the previous programming period to the present one, there was a lot of debate, and of course many of the people in this room are heavily involved in these debates, along with hundreds and hundreds of others, all contributing data, narratives, ideas, case studies, experience, wider discussions. There was new ideas which were emerging from many, many different sources, from in different arenas in economics, international development, science policy, economic geography, political science, and also many, many famous scholars who were not writing about cohesion policy or even Europe per se, particularly people like Danny Roderick, Eleanor Ostrom, and so on. Institutions, the smart specialization agenda, Dominic Faure, and so on. There's huge numbers of people involved in this. I try to detail these things as much as I can in my book. And there were already different lines of evidence and argumentation which captured the dynamics, the different aspects of the shifting economic landscape which was emerging across Europe. And we saw this in the previous cohesion reports. And if you go back, you look right back to the first row cohesion reports, you see patterns which are developing and emerging. It's a very good exercise in itself. It's not something that's just come out of the sky. Many of the things that were already there tell you stories about where we are today and why. Not the complete picture, of course, but they provide a lot of clues. But of course we had the shock effects of the global financial crisis. The biggest effect of which was that the long-run process of convergence, which we'd experienced across Europe between countries and broadly at the regional level, it's a bit more complicated. There's groups of regions going in different directions, what we call convergence clubs or divergence clubs. But the broad story in Europe was one of convergence. That process went into reverse. So instead of weaker and less prosperous regions slowly catching more prosperous regions, the evidence is that that process went into reverse. And many of the weaker regions were the regions which suffered the most post-crisis. It's a more complex picture than that, but that's broadly the story. And that's very clear, as you see from the 6th Cohesion Report. But the different reform elements in terms of the new programs, the key elements, conditionality, strengthened partnership principles, smart specialization, a results-oriented approach, monitoring, evaluation, a more integrated approach with a common strategic framework, ITIs, CLLD approaches, a kind of community enhancement, integrated approaches. These were not because of the crisis. These discussions were taking place in these offices years before the crisis, because it's a long-run rethinking process. But I think given the experience of the crisis, the timeliness could not have been better. Actually, these discussions were already ongoing and were already involved in the negotiations and renegotiations. Other themes such as the enhanced urban agenda are also important, and that's one of the key themes I'm going to pick up in this talk. Now, when we think about cities and regions and things like technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, growth, inequality, equality, all that kind of stuff, you often get a very distorted picture when you read a kind of popular press. I mean, I'm very, very wary of reading the popular press on these things because they tend to pick out one particular statistic or one particular fact, factoid probably rather than fact, and then it's a headline. And, you know, then people will run with that headline if it's kind of where they want to see things are going. The picture is much more complex, and the best sources to understand the picture of what we experience is by looking at the OECD data, which is by far the most comprehensive, and it's standardized. That's important. You can compare. What do we see? Well, growth in the pre-crisis period, so the 1990s, the early 2000s, most economies were growing strong, modern globalization, technology was spreading, low interest rates, low inflation. You know, the economy is pretty good. For most countries, very low unemployment, record levels in many countries. What do we see? The patterns of growth across cities and regions were actually very heterogeneous. It wasn't simply a big city story. It was a much more complicated picture than that. But there were a lot of political narratives out there which tended to present a very simple story. I mean, even the academic world kind of triumph of the city. It's not the case across the OECD. That's not what the data says. And it's certainly not the case in Europe. It's a much more nuanced picture. And it's understanding those nuances which is really important, where policy interventions and actions are going to be taking place. What did we see? Well, there's basically similar probabilities of regions outperforming, underperforming, or equally performing their national growth rates, whether they're urban or regional. Green are rural, urban or regional. Green are rural, blue are urban. This is across OECD countries. The dispersion is higher amongst rural areas, tend to be lower population areas and so on. But the actual probability in terms of growth performance relative to the national economy is largely independent of the type of place. That's not the kind of narrative we normally hear. What we also see is the benefits of concentration and scale, the agglomeration type of argument, they're neither linear nor are they infinite. It's not necessary, or it's not naturally the case that growth is related to agglomeration, city stories. It may be, and there are many conditions where it is, but there's also a lot of evidence in many other situations that's not the case. It's a much more complex story. It may be related to things like networks, different types of understandings of accessibility, amenities, institutional issues, land use planning issues. In fact, the evidence from the OECD, across all of the OECD, as well as the European countries within the OECD, is that actually endogenous factors really are the critical markers. You have to look for clues inside particular countries to understand what's going on there. Interestingly, when you think about modern globalization, so from the 1990s onwards, the kind of productivity levels, we often talk about a spiky world, higher productivity levels in core cities, places like Amsterdam, Brussels, London, global cities at the center of global networks. The OECD calls them the major hubs. We're talking about places like Stockholm, Madrid, these kinds of cities, Seattle, New York, and so on. And these are places which have higher productivity. On average, they're more prosperous, they're richer, productivity levels are higher. But interestingly, while the levels are higher, their share of output, their contribution to economic growth has been steadily falling for about 15 years. Why? Because in the post-new millennia era, in the 2000s, actually growth has been increasingly accounted for by smaller and medium-sized cities. And that's an OECD-wide phenomenon. It's not true in every single country, but across the OECD as a whole, it is true. And it's certainly a European story in many parts of Europe that I'll show you in a second. Indeed, the growth role of what we call the non-core regions, those that generally don't appear in the press, is actually extremely important and increasing. It may be related to distance. There's some evidence of that. I'll show you this, how close you are or how distant you are from major centres. We'll talk about that in a second. But in the European case, but at least prior to the crisis, there wasn't particularly a strong effect which is related to distance. It's a more mixed picture. The evidence on the distance-related effect prior to the crisis, at least, was probably stronger in the United States. But here's a way to think about this. If you think about the urban system of the OECD, so we've got cities at the top are the largest cities, places like Tokyo, New York. They are the rank 1 city. Rank 1 in the OECD is Tokyo, the world's largest city, followed by rank 2 is Seoul, rank 3 is New York, and then you come down through Osaka, Los Angeles, then you're down to Paris, London, Madrid. So the higher numbers are smaller places. Right? That's how to think about it. And of course, there are hundreds of cities across the OECD. Over time, what you see is the places which are, on average, the highest growth rates, measured either in terms of population and GDP growth, population density and GDP growth, population GDP growth per capita. There's different ways of measuring things. But actually, the average rank of the most dynamic places has been steadily increasing through the 1990s and 2000s. If it was all focused on the big cities, these ranks would be falling. Actually, on every indicator, they're increasing. Why? Because quietly, largely under the radar, most growth has not been in the big places, which are, if you like, the global cities. The global cities have had very important growth contributions in many countries. My own country, the UK, probably more so than anywhere else. But is that the general picture across most countries? The answer is no. 2/3 of economic growth pre the crisis was driven by non-core places that basically only ever appear in the local press. Why? Because actually growth was exhibiting a convergence process. The places which were largely off the radar screen, not as prosperous, not as big, were actually systematically catching up. In particular, even at the bottom end, regions with less than 75% GDP per capita of their own national averages were accounting of almost half of economic growth, so the ones really a long way down. In fact, depending on the country, more than half, and sometimes close to 2/3, was accounted for by parts of the country with productivity levels below the national average. So smaller non-core areas actually systematically across the board were growing quicker. That does not mean every region in every country. It means the overall picture. And this all comes from the OECD data. Some of the other things that we think of as natural drivers of growth when we think about these stories, and I've written as much on these issues as many people, the kind of human capital migration story, people moving into the prosperous cities, thinking about different dynamics related to innovation, entrepreneurship. These are kind of standard narratives in many countries. Actually, entrepreneurship has been exhibiting long-term falls for more than a decade, close to 2 decades in many countries, the levels of entrepreneurship. The really remarkable one is that migration rates have been falling across regions. And that's true in most countries, and it's particularly true in the United States. And this was prior to the crisis. We have narratives that, you're born in Wisconsin, you study in Chicago, then you're working in New York, you pick up a job in Houston, it's off to LA for a few years, back up to Seattle. That's the kind of American lifestyle. It's for a tiny subset of the US population, and those rates are falling. Interestingly, interregional migration in the US is only marginally higher than it is in either the UK or the Netherlands. So you have to think about what are the vast majority of people doing. They're not doing what a lot of our narratives say. The other aspect of Europe which is very important is Europe is simply so heterogeneous. The role of major cities, global type cities, is extremely significant in countries such as the UK, France, Spain, Poland, Czech Republic. The core city story, Slovakia would be another example. But in other parts of Europe, the story is rather different. The Netherlands, northern Italy, many parts of Germany, more of a polycentric type of story. Lots of cities network, but there's not really a dominant core. In terms of migration patterns, what we have is urban to urban. In Northern Europe, in the richer European Union countries, almost all migration is urban to urban. There is almost no rural to urban migration, whereas rural to urban migration is still the overwhelming driving force in Central and Eastern Europe. as people are moving from the rural-based economies into the urban economies. So we get the growth of the core cities in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe. And there are still some residual patterns of that in parts of the Mediterranean as well. But certainly countries such as Italy, and particularly Spain, went through these processes 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now it's more an urban-to-urban story again. But again, these are the patterns that tell you why there were convergence processes going on. But interestingly, if you look at the metro areas, metropolitan urban regions, so this is the Eurostat data that Lewis and the team here work with, what you see actually in the period, so let's say between the millennium and just before the crisis, the growth contribution, the share of growth accounted for by cities, metro regions of over a quarter of a million people, actually only changed by 0.5%. In other words, nothing happened. There was no, in the post-millennium to the crisis, there was no big surge of global cities in Europe. It's not the overall picture. There was in some countries. The UK, as I say, is an obvious case. But is that a general pattern? The answer is no. Interestingly, the system now is more complicated than I've just described. Why? Because there's been a shift, and the shift between two time periods and between more or less two different parts of Europe in terms of the relative primacy and contribution of different places. In the 1990s, the modern era of globalization, you think about outsourcing, offshoring, attracting global markets, the places that were best suited, best positioned to take advantage of those opportunities were largely global type cities, places that were very well connected on many levels. Not just physical transportation movements, things like airports, but also university systems, corporate research centres, think tanks, political advisory things, where you're connected, your reach is naturally outside of your region and your country. You're automatically embedded, connected. Those are the kinds of places that in the new era of globalization in the 1990s was able to kind of capitalize on the fact that these are knowledge-related transformations at the global level. And that was the story in the 1990s. But actually what happened was, after the early 2000s, we kind of seemed to have got used to it, kind of got a handle on how to do these things. And things started to change. And I'll just show you these graphics here. I'm just going to... Here we are. What we see, in order to read this, the black line are predominantly urban regions, the black line. The dotted line are predominantly intermediate regions. This is the OECD classification. So small towns, rural areas, all mixed up. And the green line would be primarily rural regions. What you see is that this is growth rates. These are moving average growth rates. And you see the black line, which are the urban areas, is basically in the vanguard, is at the lead right up till 2002. But then there's a switch. The urban areas then fall behind the other types of regions. And the rural areas and the intermediate areas are kind of crisscrossing each other. And then, of course, we get to the crisis in 2008 where everything goes down. But for the moment, what I want you to focus on is 2002. 2002 is the switch in Western Europe. And Lewis and I, along with Enrique, we have papers published on this already, that the growth dynamics in Europe, in Western Europe, were dominated by, in the 1990s, the urban areas. It was an urban story in the 1990s and the very early 2000s. But from about 2002 onwards, the Western European pattern, as in the EU15, shifted and growth dynamics became dominated not by the urban areas, but by all these other types of areas, the ones which are largely under the radar screen. And this is a very clear finding. The results are very robust, and it's largely, in a sense, black and white, as an EU-wide phenomenon. Whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, the pattern which persisted in the 1990s has continued. It's almost entirely, it's dominated by the urban transformations. People moving in from rural areas and smaller towns into bigger cities. So the kind of stories that we might tell about cities like Bratislava, Warsaw and so on are ongoing. Bucharest, Sofia, this is the story. This is continuing. It's very much a textbook type of thing. It's led by the cities, followed by the smaller towns, and then the rural areas are kind of at the bottom of the pile. Why? Because people are leaving, people are moving out. There's much more action in the bigger cities, whereas Europe in the West has gone into reverse. It's a different type of story. Why that is, well, you can start telling lots of different stories as well. There's complex patterns of commuting, polycentric type systems, there's different work routines. Nowadays, we can, a lot of people telework, they work on the train, they work at home 1, 2, 3 days a week. Companies in London often want a lot of their workers not to be in the office. They want them working at home, just coming in for meetings. Why? Because real estate's super expensive. And we don't need everybody in the office 8, 9, 10 hours a day in many cases. So you can think about different work roles. There's lots of stories we can tell. The answer is we don't know. Those are the kind of stories we think it is. Certainly the work of people like Mark Partridge and Rose Olfert in the United States is pointing at those kind of explanations. But this is also a US phenomenon. It's not just a European phenomenon. So there's a lot more happening about which we don't know too much. What we do know is that the role of connectivity, broadly defined, transportation, knowledge flows, flows of human capital, flows of assets, funds, fund management, all of those things are intrinsically related to the structure of the airline system. And it's very clear the data on Europe, having direct intercontinental flights is a game changer. There's a lovely paper by Bell and Fajeda in 2008 in the Journal of Economic Geography. And basically, the argument is looking at the structure of the European regional economies, the size of the city, the diversity, the specialization of the city, the size of the national economy, all of these things tend to come out in the wash. It's the network structure related to transportation systems is critically important relative to corporate systems and decision making. So it's part of a broader story. It's not simply a size effect, there's network effects going on, and so on. But of course we need more work on this. Now let me tell you something about the city structure, and this is, Lewis and I have already published this stuff, as I say, previously, so all of this is in the public domain. These are productivity levels in cities grouped by country and normalized with respect to the non-urban productivity levels in each country. So how to read this? Here is Italy. Just over half of Italian cities have productivity levels prior to the crisis which are higher than the non-urban productivity in Italy. And about half of Italian cities have productivity levels below that of non-urban areas in Italy. Germany is almost half, just under half of German cities have productivity levels below non-urban areas, small town Germany. The UK, about 1/3. Whereas if I look over here, these are Central and Eastern European economies, so we've got Slovakia, Poland, and so on. It's a fairly simple story. Nearly all of the cities have higher productivity levels than the non-urban areas, which is why people migrate into the cities. That's where most of the action is. But the important take-home point from this is that there are many parts of Europe where a significant share of the large cities, these are not small cities, these are large cities, and they're standardized to metro to include all the kind of metro characteristics, commuting and so on. A very large share, look at Spain, more than half of the cities have productivity levels which are below the non-urban areas. This is prior to the crisis. So the standard kind of textbook argument, I write these textbooks myself, where we assume that kind of cities are higher productivity levels, the world is spiky type of discussions. Actually, it's not so straightforward because in many cases that's not the case. You have to say which country are we talking about and precisely which cities are we talking about. So if I take the case of the UK, of course there are a bunch of cities whose productivity levels are way, way above the non-urban areas. Look at the spike in the UK. This is London, the darker. Darker means bigger city. But there's about 1/3 of UK cities, including some very, very big cities, that have productivity levels below small town England or small town UK. That's the kind of take-home insight to think about. This is prior to the crisis. If you look in terms of changes in labour productivity, we have the same thing. We have the UK levels, or we have the French levels in green, for the non-urban areas, the non-metro areas, and then we've got the changes in dynamics country by country. What do we see? Well, again, if I take the UK case, what we see is there's about 1/3 of UK cities which have got productivity performance levels, growth in productivity, these are not levels, but the growth level, the growth rate, is less than non-urban areas. Not only many of them are in absolute terms below, their growth is even below. In relative terms, they're going backwards. And there's a lot of other data on the UK that tells exactly the same story. What do we see? Italy. 2/3, 3/4 of cities' growth, performance and productivity was below non-urban areas. Yeah? You can see what the numbers, look at Germany, 3/4, Spain, just over half. Again, why? Because it's this convergence process. So much of the growth performance that was driving the national levels is actually contained in these types of small town places, which are below the radar screen. This is why. There are some cities whose growth performance is phenomenal, and some of them are very big. In the UK case, you can probably guess which many of these are. Tremendous performance in terms of levels of productivity and growth performance, but they're coexisting in a country where many cities, the trajectory is completely the opposite, and they're all big places. Growth at the national level by lots of places which are basically under the radar screen or out of the interest of the popular press. And that's also manifested in population change. Why? Because places which are growing rapidly, productivity is growing, that's where wages are increasing, they tend to attract, they tend to suck people in, because that's where jobs are, that's where new openings are, and so on. And again, you look at the countries, what do we see? I take the UK case, which is here. About 45% of UK cities are growing in terms of population relative to the national average, but more than half are growing more slowly than the UK as a whole, and some of these are growing negatively in absolute terms. And you see the same picture in all of the other countries as well. So there's a strong message here about winners and losers. It's not big cities versus small, it's not urban versus rural, it's tell me which country you're talking about and I'll tell you what the patterns look like. But you cannot simply say, well, in the UK it looks like this, therefore it looks like the same in Germany or in Italy, because it doesn't. And what we see in Germany doesn't tell you what's happening in Poland. What we see in Slovakia doesn't help you very much looking at the Netherlands. We can talk about European-wide aggregate trends, yes we can, but we cannot simply transpose one national experience onto another. They're much more complicated. What's the basic story? I'm going to flip through some slides here, but what's the basic story? Post-crisis, primarily urban areas and primarily rural areas which are also remote are the places which have been least resilient post-crisis. I say it's not triumph of the city. It's triumph of actually many small and medium-type places and rural areas which are close to cities. Those are the places which in general have responded the best, on average. But again, it's very different country by country. So that's the story. And how are we going to show this? Well, I'll go back to these data. If you remember, these are the characterizations. Black are predominantly urban areas. These are the OECD characteristics. What we've got is the 2002 is the switch, as you can see, where the urban areas no longer are in the vanguard of European growth. And the relationship, the ordering becomes inverted. And then the intermediate areas and the rural areas are kind of following each other. Well, actually, this is in terms of the growth rates. And we can look at this in terms of also by splitting rural areas up. Because rural areas which are very remote have very different experiences to rural areas which are actually close to urban areas. Many parts of the Netherlands where I live, there's a lot of rural areas that are actually very accessible from cities. There's many parts of Europe where this is the case. What do we see? Well, primarily rural, which is close to the cities, those places have done well since the crisis. You can see, before the crisis in the 1990s up to about 2002, they were not particularly doing very much. But post-crisis, they've come out the strongest, followed by intermediate areas, so the rural areas close to cities, followed by the intermediate areas, and the urban areas, primarily urban areas, and remote rural, the ones who've performed, at least across Europe as a whole, those who have performed the least in terms of the responses since the crisis. And we can measure this on a whole series of different indicators, and basically the pattern doesn't really change. Again, this is all published in the academic literature. We see the same thing. This is doing it in terms of GDP per capita, Same thing, so the previous one was GDP growth, this GDP per capita, you basically get the same story. Again, when you split it up according to the typology, it doesn't really change. We can do it in terms of gross value added per worker. So those actually in employment. Of course, that's slightly more complicated to interpret because it depends on absorption rates and activity rates and so on. But still, the picture doesn't particularly change. Again, we break them up according to different typologies. In terms of unemployment rates, the other side of the equation, the picture varies a little bit. It's a bit more complicated because different countries have responded in terms of employment shocks in different ways, as we know. But the general story I'm telling you doesn't change particularly. All of these things are published, and the explanations and the narrative about it are all out there in the public domain, published earlier on this summer in the Journal of Economic Geography. So we can actually look at these and say, well, basically, in terms of vulnerability post-crisis, the places which are the most vulnerable, highest levels of vulnerability are primarily rural, remote regions, PRR, and primarily urban. And those which are least vulnerable in terms of the crisis, post-crisis, are primarily rural, which are close, PRC, and intermediate regions, small town, rural, all mixed up. And that's a general story, and it holds across Europe as a whole. But we can split up the EU15 and the EU13 because there are some differences here. Again, you have to go through these tables fairly carefully to understand them, but just a kind of a snapshot. EU15 in the top part, before the crisis, EU15 post-crisis, EU13 Central and Eastern European countries prior to the crisis, post-crisis. What do we see? Well, in the kind of period prior to the crisis, capital and metro areas were doing pretty well, second-tier metro. They were doing pretty well in terms of GDP per head growth. Productivity growth was strong. Employment per head growth was not too bad. Second-tier metros were slightly higher. Smaller metros are doing pretty well. What do we see post-crisis? That the bigger places, the shock effects on GDP per capita were very, very big. So GDP per head growth, productivity growth. Of course, productivity growth increases the more people that lose their jobs as well. You have a backward effect in terms of diminishing marginal productivity. Employment per head growth was very, very weak in many of the big cities. This is the Western European story, whereas the Central and Eastern European story, prior to the crisis, it's a very simple ordering. Bigger cities, higher productivity growth in terms of GDP per head. Productivity growth is strong at the top end of the urban system. Employment growth per head, very, very high. It's a very relatively simple, bigger city story. Post-crisis, actually what you see is that some of those shock effects are very real now in Central and Eastern Europe. It's not simply that the big cities have carried on growing and everything's fine. It's not. It's a much more mixed picture. And some of the productivity performance, the better performance, even in Central and Eastern Europe, has actually been slightly lower down the urban system. But still, of course, the growth performance in general of these cities relative to the EU15 has been better on average, but again, you have to say country by country, region by region. It's a very, very heterogeneous picture, but this gives you kind of a flavour for what's going on. What does that imply? Well, I'm going to use this language very, very carefully, is that in some sense, cities exacerbate the national post-crisis trends. That does not mean they cause them. Just in very simple correlation terms, they are associated. This is what the evidence tells us, in the sense that countries which are growing and relatively robust in the post-crisis era are also associated with cities, and particularly big cities, which are performing well. Productivity is strong, it's resilient, and growth in those cities, population growth, productivity growth has held up strongly. So countries in general which post-crisis have been doing pretty well, cities seem to be in the vanguard of that performance. But conversely, where countries have been struggling post-crisis, cities also seem to be particularly struggling. So this story about the resilience of cities is kind of bimodal. There are countries in where cities have been performing very well, and those countries seem to be doing very well in general, and there are many countries where cities are very, very much underperforming, and those countries as a whole are underperforming. Now, of course, on one level, you could simply say, well, this sounds like a tautology, because most people live in cities. countries like the UK, the Netherlands, 77% of the population live in metro areas. The European average is well over 50%, it's around 60%, something like that. So the fact that the majority of people live in big cities, this is kind of a tautology. Well, maybe, maybe not. It's probably a little bit more complex than that. What we do know is that we've gone from convergence to divergence again. Again, not true in every country, but that's a general pattern. But as I say, not true in every country. Nice paper by Vasilis Monasteriotis in Spatial Economic Analysis last year, documents country by country. But what it does do is raise the focus and the emphasis on thinking about the lagging regions. And of course that relates to the policies here. Given these kind of shifting landscapes, maybe we ought to rethink a little bit about how we use the policies, where our priorities might be. One of the issues that seems to be prevalent, but it's very, very hard to find literature which has really substantiated these things post-crisis, are the effects of real estate markets. Why is that? Because I've just been reading an article by Ben Bernanke today. We still don't know a lot about what happened. The effects, the contagion effects, were so complicated in the financial services industries. I mean, don't forget the whole crisis was triggered by a failure of just 3% of US real estate assets. Not 3% of assets and not 3% of real estate assets. 3% of US real estate assets led to the effects that we've seen since the crisis. Carlo Padoan used to be chief economist of the OECD. It's still very difficult for all subjects, particularly economic and finance, to understand precisely what happened. So any comments I'm making here are largely guesswork. I would like to say educated guesswork, but I'm not really sure it's that. I think it's largely anecdotal-based guesswork. But I can think of mechanisms, and I'm sure we can all think of mechanisms, so let's just try this, because it relates to the final issue I'm going to talk about in a moment. One of the things we know is that most business investments, particularly small and medium-sized businesses or family businesses, people use real estate as the collateral to get bank funding. Bank funding, business loans, are based primarily on real estate assets. And certainly in the UK, the evidence on this is very, very clear. Places where real estate prices were increasing prior to the crisis are the places where credit rates were increasing for SMEs. And then since the crisis, places where the real estate markets came down the quickest, that's where the contractions were fastest. It's slightly a chicken and egg situation, but real estate is a critical mechanism within the credit creation processes. Yeah? Why? Because debt financing is based on nominal values of assets, and this is why it's excellent having Gunther here, because it's a real estate question, many aspects of this. But what we know about the nature of the financial crisis was that a problem that started in US real estate industry spread globally and infected the real economy outside of the real estate markets. So many companies that one month had very strong balance sheets, they were in the black, 6 months later are suddenly in the red, even though nothing substantially has changed. Why? Because many of them, their financial structures suddenly look completely different because it was based on debt collateral which had gone into reverse. So suddenly their equity positions, their gearing positions and so on start to, instead of going up, they start going down. And this itself has additional contagion effects. Why is that important in terms of cities and regions? Because most real estate debt is in cities. And when cities burst, the effects on everything are much greater than if small towns burst. And you think about the problems in many parts of Europe, particularly the countries struggling, many of those problems are centered on cities, many of which are large. We've got to find ways to get those capital markets moving again, but it's very difficult when people's debt positions are as they are. So one argument is that cities have been central also in the transmission mechanisms where things are not going well. Cities also work the other way. We know the agglomeration stories, that people moving into cities, expectations go up, the speculation, people borrow money on investment, they invest in new activities, new innovations, new entrepreneurship, knowledge spillovers, all that, that's all the good story. But there's also another story that cities are central to. And I'm just telling a story, a kind of an anecdote based on observation, because we don't really have any data on this. It's very, very difficult. But at least we can see a possible type of mechanism that would start to give us some sort of handle on what's happening here. This has an additional effect. And the effect is a long-run one related to demographics. More than 1/3 of Europe's cities today are shrinking in population. 1/3 of Europe's cities, and this was prior to the crisis. Remember the slides I showed you a few minutes ago? About 1/3 of Europe's cities were already shrinking prior to the crisis. And of course, if the kind of shock contagion effects I'm suggesting have some substance, some veracity, then many of those dynamics are going to be exacerbated. Why? Because one response to shocks is migration between regions, between cities, between countries. But that then raises a whole different set of issues, which many of us here in the policy arena, many of you will be these are things that many of you will deal with regularly, are fiscal issues at the city and the regional level. And that's very important for the kind of debates where our policy sits. The long-term financial basis of many financial investments, infrastructure investments and so on at the city level, the basis for those things starts to become problematic because of the final point here that I'm going to talk about quickly, is the demographic shifts. So think about the fact that many cities in Europe were already vulnerable prior to the crisis. But as long as aggregate growth was positive, inflation rates were low, credit was freely available, it was not seen as a point of concern by economists in general, by politicians in general. Very, very few people, if you look back prior to the crisis, I haven't found a single article in the academic literature that raised the issue. And newspaper articles and so on, hardly anybody was talking about these things. But of course now they're very real. So there was some grounds for thinking that there were vulnerabilities prior to the crisis. Those seem to have been exposed post-crisis, and now we've got another set of things that we have to think about medium and long term. We have to think about the relationship between the working age population and the non-working age population, primarily the retirees and, of course, young children. But primarily this is about an aging problem. By 2050, Western European labour supply will be lower than it was in the 1990s. The size of the labour force which is available for work. By 2050 in Japan, it'll be lower than it was in the 1970s. Japan is basically going backwards half a century in terms of population shift. By 2030, the EU working age population is projected to fall by 6%. These are the EU's own data, the EU Ageing Report and the OECD work on cities and ageing, which complements that. And you look at the figures by 2030, the working age population is projected to fall by 12% in Germany, Spain and Portugal, by 7% in Ireland, 4% in the Netherlands, and there's a small number of countries where it's forecast to increase. It's entirely due to immigration. Increases in age-related expenditure, you think about healthcare, social care, these kinds of activities, many of which are funded partially at the local and the regional level, funded and delivered. Partially, and it's different extents, but you can start to see where I'm going with this. Many of these age-related expenditures will increase by more than 4% of GDP across Europe and 4.5% across the Eurozone. This is the work of, say, the European Commission, the Ageing Reports, and particularly the OECD Ageing in Cities document. The older age, in the UK, my own country, the older age cohort will increase from 9.7 to 15.8 by 2030. Why is that important? Because they become the most important voting cohort in terms of what their preferences are. Yeah, that's very, very important. This is a global phenomenon, we're aware of this. At the margin, relatively short time preference in terms of forward-looking. Why? Because it's about needs, it's about provision. I need care and health care and social services now. I can't wait for 10 or 15 years. So there's a relative short-term demand, which is necessary, and that preference will increase because the number of people moving up what we call the population tree is getting faster and faster and faster. So on any level, both in terms of societal needs and also in terms of political representation, these issues are going to become more and more significant. I often think the strange thing is it's been completely off most political agendas in most countries until the last couple of years, I would say. Strange, because demographers knew these stories 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Population projections from the 60s are pretty accurate today. Why? I was born in the 60s. And people who are aging today were born in the 50s and the 40s. The only thing that's different are the effects accounted for by migration. shock effects, movements between countries, between cities. No one was able to forecast these. It's not a mistake on anyone's part. Simply, the mechanisms didn't exist in the way that they do today. It's very, very hard to see these. But the aggregate effects in terms of population shift, demographers have known this stuff for years and have tried to put these issues on the table. The first real substantial document I saw from the European Commission on this, I'm sure Peter or Lewis may correct me if there's other things, was the one by DG Regio in 2008-2009. The demographic role towards Europe 2020. The regional demographic contribution. I haven't seen anything earlier than that. This was 2008, 2009. We've known this stuff since the 60s and 70s. But it's not been a political issue because it's so far in the future. It's not far in the future now. It's happening at an amazingly quick rate. But it's different between countries. But I'll give you some examples from the UK. These are from the OECD data. You think about, in my own country, the UK case, these demands for healthcare, social care, they're going to get bigger and bigger at a faster and faster rate. Think about the political logic that underlies that. If cities and regions are playing an increasingly important role in the provision and delivery of these services, which they are, more and more responsibility at the local and the regional level. Yet the problem is, how are we going to fund these things? Because age-related tax exemptions are just about bigger than any form of tax exemption in my country. And of course, how do you change tax exemptions? Well, you have to have a political power, but not if the political lobby with those exemptions is going to get bigger. You've got to square the circle somehow. What happens? It falls on the younger generations. And this is the question about the working age population versus the non-working population, non-working age population. The story I'm telling about the UK is actually typical in many countries across Europe. In the UK magazine called Prospect, Isabel, could you just get my bag? It's just there. My leather bag. There's an article in there. Just pass it over. The stories I'm telling about the UK, of course, that's the economy I know the best. I've just finished writing a 500-page book on the UK economy. But this is, I think, the best political magazine in Britain. It's called Prospect. It's completely politically neutral. It's great thinkers, great writers. The battle of our time, workers versus pensioners. This is Charles Goodhart, one of the most famous financial economists of the second half of the 20th century. Starts to document these issues. They're super complicated. There's not simple stories. But the point is to get people thinking about it. At the city level, share of people over 65 is going to increase fourfold, over 80, increased by 14-fold. Has been in the last 60 years, the transformations. These things are going to increase. If you look at the OECD cities of over 300,000, 100 large cities are shrinking in absolute terms, up from 10 in 1950, only 30 in the 1950s. But what does it mean? It means that political narratives are going to shift slowly, because as people become more aware, these are extremely difficult issues. As I say, a third of Europe's metro regions were already shrinking. We know that this is a global trend. We've seen this since the 1950s. The number of people of pensionable age was actually very tiny. It was only 7% in 1950, and only 1% of people survived over 80. The life expectancy of almost every country in Europe today, for both men and women, is over 80. And in some parts of Europe, it's much higher than that. We talk about distinctions now between the new old and the older old, or the young old and the older old. There are big differences we know now between people between, say, 65 and 75, and the over 75s, not just in terms of their healthcare needs, but also where they live. In the Netherlands, they're moving in the opposite directions. The young old want to go live in nice environments where there's golf courses and so on. And the older old are coming back into cities where the healthcare services are. We're seeing these things in the United States. We also see divisions within cities. Across the OECD, core metro areas, city centres, if you like, of the big cities, they're younger than the hinterland areas. Young people surrounded by old people. But in Europe, it's the other way around. Northern Western Europe, core metro, are younger than hinterlands, but in Southern Europe, the cores are younger than the outside is younger than the inside. So how you think about cities in terms of provision of healthcare is very dependent on which country we're talking about, because the demographics are quite different geographically across cities. But we do know that cities are actually aging faster than the population as a whole. And think about, again, that a lot of our fiscal issues related to the kind of services for older people are at the city and the regional level. But in many parts of Europe, cities are on the wrong side of these trends. Yeah. The OECD actually categorizes cities basically according to aging and slow growth. Cities which are aging and they have slow growth. There's also cities which are young but aging rapidly, and cities which are young and aging slowly. This is how the OECD categorizes them. Type 1 cities, these are the aging and slow growth. They'll reach their peak population and then start to decline. And some of those peak populations are already being reached. The young but aging rapidly, they'll face changing demands, but they're further into the future because they're starting from a much more youthful population. If I take the case of the UK, the youngest city in Britain is London. Why? Because it's just got so many young people, high income, high education moving into London. And the young and aging slowly, well, they face the least challenges. That's more like the London type of story. And of course, if you think about your own countries, you can start to see, you can guess which cities are aging, which are aging quickly and which are not. Why? Because the crucial element is human capital, is skills. Why is it the crucial element? Because higher skilled people are more geographically mobile. The people who move, on average, are more highly educated. And that has severe consequences for cities and regions. Because you can think about cities which are relatively aging, all cities and regions all of our populations are aging, but the cities which are aging and are also experiencing increasing incomes, and these are amenity-related places where people move in for more leisure consumption. They tend to be expensive, people are moving in, buying houses for nice environments. They have complicated issues, but they're relatively benign. Cities which are young and aging slowly, the London type story, in the long run is in a much better position because they're highly educated, inflows of high human capital, which counters the natural population aging effect. And the difficult ones are those which are aging and declining. They're aging the quickest because they face the most rapid out-migration of young people. As young people leave, the population tree gets older and older because it's a residual of the people who are left behind, and those who are leaving are generally of higher skills. They're younger and more skilled. They're moving to places like the London case I've mentioned. So what happens is they're on the wrong side of the demographic trends. So you think about the policy intervention, the kind of things that the cohesion policies deal with. Well, you're going to have to start thinking about age-related built environments. How do we restructure our cities at local, community, neighborhood level, transportation facilities? Can we develop more integrated approaches because the population in 20 years is not going to look like it does today? There's strong arguments for this. Age-related housing wealth and affordability. There's much more of an insider-outsider experience in many cities. Cities, in many cases, are becoming more unequal, and higher income groups are dominating real estate markets. 1st of December, Paul Krugman article in the New York Times called Inequality and the City. Same things in the United States. European cities and regions are facing the same problems. We have to think about how do we cope with the fact that you've got differences in real estate wealth effects by age cohort, differences in terms of the ability to move into real estate markets to acquire wealth over one's lifetime, big effects between age cohorts. In the European case, some of the wealthier countries actually have lower levels of home ownership and wealth acquisition than other parts of Europe. So you can't simply borrow narratives from the United States or the UK. We don't know. The other thing we do know is older and older people, higher shares are living alone. As more people age, also more people are living home. Around a third of old people are living alone. Think about again, how do you provide services? How do you provide infrastructure? It's particularly important at the subnational level, the city and regional level, because subnational authorities are taking on more and more of these roles across almost all of the OECD. On a kind of a place-based type argument, many of the arguments that I would advocate in terms of economic development, there are strong grounds for arguing in favour of that. On the other hand, there are also particular challenges and risks regarding fiscal liabilities in the long run, few of which are being talked about in the press. I don't think there's a great deal of understanding about these types of issues out there in the popular arenas. I often hear people talking about, don't go against the market, don't intervene with policies. If places are shrinking, let them. Just what you need to do is have a kind of pragmatic downsizing, go with the market. And my view is actually managing urban decline, pragmatic downsizing, pragmatic demographic downshifting, whatever you want to call it, is actually extremely complicated and itself requires resources. A very simple way of doing it, understanding that, is a place which is growing. You've got demand pressures on land markets, property prices are moving up, you've got constraints. Constraints are good for land markets because nominal asset prices go up, therefore that increases leveraging, people can invest, you've got the speculation processes taking place, which drive the creation and the transformation of cities. And for urban planners, that's easy. You can draw areas, you can zone things, and the markets are pushing up against those boundaries. You can manage and you can coordinate economic development and expansion. You can plan for where you put infrastructure because you know that the demand is there. It's there because the market is saying we want land, we want to transform land to the built environment, and we're going to zone it there. It works. The problem is in reverse, it doesn't work because bankruptcies and negative equity happen randomly. That business goes bankrupt. Those people go into negative equity. That property becomes vacant. This one becomes vacant. On the reverse of the market, there's no coordination process. What does it mean? It means any existing infrastructure becomes less efficient at a faster and faster rate. And so one of the big problems that places which are facing population decline face is that existing infrastructure assets of all forms, electricity, transportation, hospital services, are becoming less and less efficient at the margin as the population is shrinking. And if they're also facing population decline of younger people as people move out, the tax base is also shrinking. So they're on the wrong side of the market on both sides. Because so much of demand in terms of decline is based on what's happening to nominal prices. You know, if my wage falls by 50% and my house price falls by 50%, I can't go back to the bank and say, look, in real terms, my wage is the same as it was. My nominal wage and my house price has fallen by 50%, but we're okay in real terms because according to microeconomics textbook, my real wage is the same as it was before. Therefore, can you write off 50% of my debt and we'll have half the mortgage I had 10 years ago? The bank will say, no. It's called negative equity. It's called bankruptcy. Because on the downside, the markets work on nominal prices. And these are extremely difficult issues for us to deal with. So I'm going to go to my very last slide. There's lots more I can talk about this. And I'm writing about these things at the moment along with other people. But these are my points. The seeds for many of the aspects that have happened at the regional and the urban level across Europe post-crisis, some of those things were already happening prior to the crisis. I'm not talking about macro issues. This is simply about what's happening at the regional and urban level, different types of places. Many of those things are already evident. Many areas we know, urban areas particularly, offer great possibilities for growth and development. That's the agglomeration, spillover type story. And many places do offer enormous possibilities and they do drive economies as a kind of a textbook model would tell you. But there are also many cases where that's not happening. Things seem to have gone in reverse, and it's particularly problematic when things go into reverse in large cities. So there, at least there's a possible policy priority that we need to think about in terms of our funds, and the increased urban agenda, I think, is well timed for targeting and thinking about that. You've got to turn cities around because the scale effects are very, very important. And then we have this medium and long term, and I say medium because it's happening so quickly, is the demographic shocks. And those demographic shocks are specifically important at the city level. Finding ways to transform our cities, to get them out of some of the difficulties that they're in, but in ways that also are going to be reoriented, re-engineered, if you like, to also address these very, very fast oncoming demographic issues, is something that really there's been almost no discussion about in many, many arenas, really very, very little, outside of the world of demography. And as I say, I think the first and the best article on this was the DG Regio one. So, and this implies significant long-term impacts in terms of government, fiscal positions at the subnational level, thinking about different types of policy trajectories, and all the debates about centre versus periphery in terms of funding structures and so on. This is all on the table, it seems to me. It has to be at some point. Okay, I'll stop there.